What we now have seen with the realignment after the 2024 election, where Biden didn't run for re-election and then obviously Kamala Harris lost, is the Democratic Party is now in a position that the Republican Party was in 2013. So I'm particularly interested in understanding how the center left or the left liberal coalition, lots of different words we could use for that, how it's going to evolve moving forward.
We're living through an age of great political, cultural, technological transformation, from the rise of artificial intelligence to demographic change and political realignment and instability. Marshall Kosloff is a senior fellow and director of special projects at the Niskanen Center. He's also the host of The Realignment, one of the most interesting podcasts out there, exploring how these great transformations are impacting our politics and this political realignment that we've been living through here in the United States and around the world for the last decade or so. I'm delighted to talk to Marshall about how this realignment is impacting families and their communities around the country and around the world. Welcome to Per Capita. Marshall, thank you so much for joining us on Per Capita. Your podcast, The Realignment, which I'm an avid listener of, is premised on the idea that the United States is experiencing a dramatic political realignment. Can you set this realignment up for us?
Yeah, so the story of the realignment really begins, I'd say, in 2013. So not just the realignment in terms of the podcast, but the idea of a political realignment. And what you saw in 2013 was the culmination of the right's sort of conception of itself from basically the post-1960s Goldwater era all the way through the Bush presidency. When McCain and then Romney lost, you obviously had a moment where the Republican Party was going to have to change in a variety of ways. And even before Trump came down the elevator in New York in 2015, you had a lot of really interesting conversations on the right. Reform conservatism is one of the specific examples of that, of how the Republican Party could realign itself to be more in touch with its working class base. In many ways, the McCain and Romney campaigns didn't really sync with that actual working class base that the Republican Party was premised on. You then obviously had Trump come in, and in many ways, the way that Trump campaigned and ran kind of sunk up with that realignment thesis. He was much more working class in orientation. He took populist stands on economics, culture, immigration, et cetera. And the realignment came about as the right was undergoing this evolution during the Trump presidency. What we now have seen with the realignment after the 2024 election, where Biden didn't run for re-election and then obviously Kamala Harris lost, is the Democratic Party is now in a position that the Republican Party was in 2013. So if the first 5 years of the realignment, the podcast started in 2019, were all about how the right was changing, I'm particularly interested in understanding how the center left or the left liberal coalition, lots of different words we could use for that, how it's going to evolve as it's clear that it's sort of 50-year project since the New Deal era came to a close in the 60s and 70s, how it's going to evolve moving forward.
And I want to talk more about that in just a few minutes. But before we move on to it, I want to hear your analysis of how this realignment is happening globally. Because in a lot of ways, I think keen observers would say this isn't just a U.S. realignment, but it is a global realignment. So situate it in the global context for us.
Yeah, that's a great follow-up, because you can't tell the story of the realignment without focusing on especially like UK and European politics. So 2015 is also the year of Brexit, where the EU project of expansion and this belief that Europe was going to continue to unify in this very consensus post-1990s Cold War sense, that also came to a close when populism upended the Tory party, when it upended the whole British political system. That's a part of it. But you've also seen over the next 8 to 10 years, a total demolishment of the status quo in European political parties. So a lot of center parties, whether they're center-right parties or center-left parties, have been under dramatic assault by populist parties on the left in some countries, populist parties on the right in other countries. And then you have like weird cases like Emmanuel Macron and then Marche party in France, where that was a center party, but it was a party that was attacking the political status quo. So the way to understand the realignment globally, and what makes this not just sort of a US focused flash in the pan, is that clearly the consensus politics that undergirded the way we approached the world, economics, culture, society, a lot of the stuff that you all focus on at Capita, obviously is impacting everyone.
So just to follow up on that, What are some of those transformations that you think have been sort of most impactful in terms of driving the realignment? Is it primarily economic? Is it primarily culture? Some combination of the above?
It's a weird mix of both. And I'm really glad that you bifurcated between economics and culture. We can sort of sort through which parts of the realignment theory were accurate and which parts were sort of not helpful. So in 2019, for example, you'll see an episode that my then co-host and Sagar and Jetty of Breaking Points did, where it was about Senator Josh Hawley. And here is this young Republican senator who, when he was at Yale Law School, is writing about Theodore Roosevelt and antitrust. And you saw Elizabeth Warren and the rise of Lena Khan before she was in government. A lot of that realignment story was told through the lens, once again, of economics. Because when you focus on what happened in 2016, like there's this famous, there's like the China shock theory there where we looked at the 2016 election through the lens of, wow, like the counties that most swung to Trump, the counties where Obama had dominated, but then Trump went on to win, were actually counties that were dramatically really affected by globalization, deindustrialization, the loss of jobs, all those different things. So the version of the story that people like to tell, and then frankly, I spent a lot of the first two seasons telling, was just sort of, we're going to see a total transformation of American politics, more centered on a left-right populist attack on the economic system. And this sort of, and the word neoliberal sounds a little academic-y for people, but I think it like really matters, because what neoliberal really means is that if we look at basically post-Reagan in America and post-Margaret Thatcher politics in the UK, there really was this consensus that actually we do need a state, we do need a government, but actually we need to let the market do things. We could deregulate. We don't live in the era of the New Deal or big government, right? Bill Clinton gives his big speech in 1996 where he literally says the era of big government is over. I do a lot of work with sort of people who study the quote neoliberal consensus, and the point that they make is that you get a consensus, and this is what a realignment will hopefully build to, is you actually see both parties come to a consensus. So you don't get a neoliberal consensus when Ronald Reagan wins re-election in 1984, because the Democrats are still arguing against that in 1988 and 1992. When Bill Clinton says, hey, era of big government is over, you then have consensus. So what ends up happening, though, is it becomes pretty clear. And I think for me personally, January 6th was clear at this moment where, leading into January 6th, Josh Hawley was just this like featured player. A lot of people in this sort of center or the establishment were really interested in. JD Vance is also in this category as well, too, because JD Vance would also talk about how capitalism wasn't working and we need to have an economics that's more people-centered. A lot of the work that y'all do, obviously. When Hawley and pre-VP, pre-Senator Vance were pretty clearly on like the J6 was an important and not just calamitous thing side of things. They made clear there's also this huge cultural element to this. And that what really mattered when it came to power wasn't just saying, hey, we're in favor of antitrust in the way that JD said. JD famously talked about how Lena Khan was his favorite member of the Biden administration. Right. Actually, it was this cultural lens. And then the last thing, because I think this is very, very clear, and this really made things make sense for me. I remember a few years ago, Senator Ted Cruz, my Texas state senator, said the GOP is now the party of the working class now. And people who were obsessed with the economics lens of the realignment just poo-pooed that. Lots of quote dunks on Twitter, lots of like, Ted Cruz, he's this traditional libertarian free market economic conservative. How could he claim we're the party of the working class now when he's a very tax cut guy? He's not an antitrust person. He's not a sit on the picket line with workers the way Josh Hawley was. But what he understood and made me understand the cultural valence of the realignment is that one of these big trends that you asked me about is also the diploma divide. How in many ways during sort of the New Deal era and during the neoliberal era, our politics really came down to race in many ways and just class in the sense of I'm working class, I'm middle class, I'm upper middle class, I'm upper class. What happened during the realignment is we actually saw people start to vote based on whether they went to college or not. That became the bifurcating point, and it just turns out that there are a whole bunch of people who are working class or who are upper to middle class who are going to vote on cultural issues. And you could say, I'm in favor of tax cuts. I'm in favor of libertarian, traditional conservative economics in a non-realignment economic way, but still say, I'm going to orient my politics around meeting working class people and exploiting the Democratic Party and liberalism and leftism's vulnerability when it comes to them on cultural issues.
Right. I mean, I think I sometimes talk about this with my friends, right? The way in which we, as college educated people, we know very few enlisted people in the military or people who have served as enlisted people in the military. And that's frankly a shame, but that illustrates the divide, I think, the cultural divide. The new right, which, perhaps is typified best by J.D. Vance, is deeply interested, at least rhetorically, in the family. So can you help us understand the role that the family is playing in this realignment, rhetoric about the family, and in fact, social policy more broadly, where that fits in the realignment?
Yeah, it's so fascinating because conservatism during the neoliberal era that the new right, this cohort of people who really rose after 2015, really argues against, also talked about the family, focus on the family. Pat Buchanan during the 1992 Republican National Convention speech, George W. Bush, lots of talk about the family. So it's not the use of the word family in your question really highlighted that really matters. It's how family is operationalized within the story that the GOP or the new right specifically is telling about itself. So during the George W. Bush to Reagan era, the family should be understood through the lens of debates about gay marriage, debates purely about abortion. Basically, the idea that you have liberals in charge of government were the enemy of the family. They're trying to impose all these different social policies. And that is how the right talked about the family. Basically, the thesis is if we can pass a constitutional amendment against gay marriage, like 2004, if we can appoint the right justices to the Supreme Court, actually the family is going to be in a pretty good space. Oh, and then of course, if you get non-governmental actors like Hollywood to not produce sort of like R-rated movies or like, all those like different things, like then the family will be in a pretty good shape. The new right doesn't reject a lot of the takes I just gave from the old traditional right when it came to liberals are imposing alien professional managerial Ivy League cultural values on people. So like this is a way where like debates about LGBTQ people, about transgender people in sports, like you could see the right having that same exact debate in the 1980s. So this is one of the few consistent through lines. What the new right does though is they add another layer on top of it, which is where their market skepticism actually comes in. So what they will say is, so yes, we agree with the old right that in 1950s era America, let's put aside like race for a second, the sort of understanding of the family was a stronger one. You had less cultural liberalism. There was more uniformity in a conservative sense. This is before the 1960s like really tore down a lot of that consensus. They would say we should focus back on that too. But what we add to the picture that the old right doesn't add is we think that the dissolution of the family wasn't just that a bunch of libs in Hollywood were producing a bunch of bad movies or bad like music acts or those different things. It wasn't just that gay marriage happened or like gay rights were expanded. It's also that capital specifically damaged the family in of itself. It wasn't just in the 1950s in terms of like the vision of the family being one the right really identified that you had a two-parent household where divorce rates were lower and like those different things. It was also that a worker could support a family and actually do that. So you could have a father who could make this, let's say, 3 to 5 kid family work by their single salary. And by their single salary actually making sense, you didn't have to have a situation where both people started to actually work outside of the home. This is why like people like Tucker Carlson, people like J.D. Vance have referenced a previous academic iteration of Elizabeth Warren before she was a politician and when she was a professor. She wrote a book in the early 2000s called The Two Income Trap. And the point of the book is just that like as you've seen just the impacts of the market changing and deindustrialization and financialization, all these like different like post-1980s things, you've actually had to have families not have women enter the workforce and just keep working even though they want to have kids or have more kids, not because they are sort of Gloria Steinem, post 50s feminist, but just because literally you cannot have just one person working. So they would say that wasn't liberalism in a social cultural sense. That isn't just Hollywood. It's not just Congress. It's not government. It's actually that like our country deindustrialized and that worker by losing his union, by losing the undergirding like economic strength of the country really fell apart. And that's a big way that they would add family to it. And then the key thing too is that like the old right would just find that critique completely alien. They just just wouldn't think about it through those ends. Or what they would basically say is, if that's a dynamic, the way we can make this better is we could offer job retraining for that father who maybe wants to make more money, or we could have more economic growth. We could create more jobs. We could create more opportunity. Maybe if he becomes a small business owner, he could work from home and spend more time with the kids. They would talk about it in a different lens that's more opportunity focused rather than the structural critique one.
Right. And all those things are things we talk quite a bit about at Capita. We talk, for example, about the loss of a family wage. We tend to think about a living wage, but that's really about individuals. And to make a family work, you have to have two individuals. Most families have to have two individuals in the workforce and working full time. And we also talk a lot about this, and we hear it consistently when we do parent roundtables with working class Americans, that they all want more time to spend with their own kids and less time with both parents in the workforce. And it doesn't look as neat as we might assume with the traditional understanding of a stay-at-home parent in our minds, but consistently, families want more time together, more time with their kids, and less time having to work a second or third part-time job just to make ends meet.
Yeah, and what I'd be super curious about is, from your perspective as a person who studies these spaces, to what degree do you find this story we're telling like a useful one?
Well, I think it's very useful. I think what's a struggle is that there's a whole sort of ecosystem of philanthropy and advocacy organizations and so forth that are still struggling to sort of adapt their mental models, their advocacy models, their funding models, and so forth to this realigned reality, and particularly its implications for families. Right? I think the politicians, who are frankly pretty close to and responsive, they're hearing from their constituents on these issues, are getting it a lot quicker than those in this sort of advocacy and philanthropy ecosystem that works on these issues. So, Marshall, I think a lot of people who think about these things believe that realignment certainly has happened on the right, and we've talked about that so far, and really solidified in the United States, at least by Trump's re-election in 2024. So let's talk a bit about how the realignment is manifesting itself on the left. And at the top, you had said something about the Democratic Party is now where the Republicans were in 2013. So how's that realignment, in a sense, going for the Democrats?
I don't think it's going that well. The Democratic Party is in a weird position where the DNC is still working on its autopsy, and it's not going to be as sweeping, I suspect, as the Republican Party's autopsy was going to be. But I think what you've seen is a lot of attempts to launch like reform initiatives on the Democratic Party that have identified a problem. So a problem that a lot of them have identified is, hey, like the Democratic Party in its current iteration cannot win 50 plus seats in the Senate. We could take control of the House. 2026 is something people are pretty optimistic about, but just looking at the Senate picture, it's just not doable. When in 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012, the Democratic Party could get huge near majorities, right? There were 60 votes in the Senate in 2009 when Barack Obama came into office. So a lot of reform organizations, whether it's Searchlight, which recently launched, or Majority Democrats, they've focused the project on that lens. So I think from a pure DC inside baseball perspective, like that's a very good question and political dynamic to focus on. And it's one that should make everyone uncomfortable, because it's not just that this is like a left punching exercise of like the way we're going to win in North Dakota again, or the way we're going to win in Missouri again, is we have to totally just sort of dunk on leftists on like culture war questions. Like that's one version, but there's also another version of like, hey, like, guess what? It turns out a lot of those voters would also find a lot of economic populism compelling if it was articulated by like the right type of candidate. So this person is probably going to be a lot more economically conservative, or they're just going to put aside cultural issues, but it's not like they're going to be a Michael Bloomberg, no labels centrist. So like that's kind of one of the mistake that was a big mistake that was made in the 2010s and the 2020s by centrists. But my problem with orienting the project around this actual mission is it's just like a deeply unsexy project that just is not one that I think is going to actually attract the right leaders or frankly the right voters, the right sort of like outside figures. Like most people don't like political parties. People don't like the Democratic Party. They don't like the Republican Party. So saying the project is we're going to save the Democratic Party, that's not something that's going to be, I think, compelling at a level that the DSA is compelling, or Bernie Sanders and the oligarchy tour are compelling, or critically, as MAGA was compelling. A real 2013 Republican Party lesson is that the problem with the autopsy wasn't just that the sort of solution they came to was analytically incorrect, and that like the way we win is by becoming more liberal on immigration policy and going more to the center, sort of the Jeb Bush approach. The problem was that it was totally top down. This was like DC based consultants and RNC types who've lived in Washington their entire lives, and then friendly media people like Sean Hannity at like an establishment institution like Fox saying top down, here's the actual message. And if there's something that I think American politics on both sides has gotten particularly bad at during these first few decades of the 21st century, is that there's this real inability to be sort of bottom up at a democratic level. What I found so compelling about MAGA and the new right is that these are it's not that they don't have elite figures attached to them. It's not that they don't have institutions. It's not that there aren't big people like Peter Thiel that fund them. It's that it didn't come from DC. Donald Trump did not say, hey, we're here to save the Republican Party. He didn't say, hey, me and my DC friends have gotten together and we've got the new plan. He came from outside the system and said, hey, we're going to make America great again. And the vehicle that we make America great again through is the GOP and the Republican Party in a two-party system. So he takes over, he develops a message, he develops an ideology, he comes up, and this is what I love about Make America Great Again. What's amazing about Make America Great Again is there's like a highbrow version of it where like you could actually see think tanks and policy papers, and it could actually guide a governing agenda. But there's also just like a lowbrow agenda, or just no, not even lowbrow, because that's like sounds disparaging. There's just like you could talk to someone on the street about this, which is basically like, hey man, like doesn't it feel like the past 20 years have been a total disaster? And the people who we send to DC to like fix these things themselves are disasters. And frankly, it's not even just DC, like in Texas. Like, doesn't it feel like UT and Texas A&M and Rice are just like these out of touch universities led by these like ivory tower elitists who also don't get it? MAGA is about bringing new leaders, new voices, new people who are going to knock all of that down and actually be serious about making America great again and punishing the people who screwed everything up, from the Iraq war to the 2008 financial crisis to how crazy everything got during BLM and COVID, right? Like that just rolls off the tongue. I can knock on my neighbor's door and just like totally do that very, very easily. That is a project that's focused on ideology. That is not a project focused on the Republican Party. Once again, the Republican Party is the vehicle. And what's been so frustrating about the center left of the Democratic Party, and just because I spent so many years on the right, I just have this instinct beaten into me literally in a way that people on the Democratic Party side don't get. I just understand, no, guys, the issue isn't the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is just the vehicle to get to the destination you're trying to get to. The actual issue is that you can't, as a left liberal project, actually come up with a consensus, unified destination we like to get there, a set of figures and actors who are actually going to drive the car, and actually something you could actually sell. And so much of the debate on the Democratic Party side has just been like, let's debate the dashboard, or let's debate the MPG, and like, let's think about a different like make and model of the car. And that is not a compelling or sexy or inviting project. So that's what I just really see lacking.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think about in relation to this conversation is that I don't know where the intellectual energy and excitement on the center left and the left is right now. And I think particularly when it comes to politicians, to elected officials, like I can't look out to 240 members of Congress and governors on the Democratic side and say, you know, that person is really coming up with some energizing ideas that the Democratic Party, to what we were saying, the Democratic Party could become a vehicle for those ideas. So can you just talk about this issue? Like, is the Democratic Party not only electorally exhausted, but intellectually exhausted? And where might there be energy emerging on the center left and on the left to match with electoral power in future cycles?
Yeah, so many things I want to respond to there. So, I'd say it's not that the Democratic Party is exhausted, but I would actually say that like American left liberalism itself is exhausted. The way people actually think about politics in the anti-party age is actually like ideology and message and story and common sense and understanding what's actually going on here. So it's not that the Democratic Party is exhausted. The Democratic Party like wins elections. The Democratic Party is
Right.
doing really well in special elections. It's that the left liberal project itself doesn't know what it's aiming for. It doesn't have a theory of where the country is going. Critically, another thing that was disproven by the 2024 election that has been really calamitous, but people really reckoned with is like the emerging Democratic majority theory. So like Rui Teixeira, John Judas, they had this book come out in 2002 called The Emerging Democratic Majority. And the whole idea was, hey, I know we just lost the 2000 election and Republicans did really well during these 2002 midterms that were really fueled by the 9/11 attacks and lead up to the Iraq War. But good news, liberals, good news, left. America is getting more diverse. People are getting more highly educated. We're transitioning to an information economy away from a industry-oriented economy. All of those trends actually bode really well for the Democratic Party. Now that that's gone, everyone is just exhausted. So what I want to see happen, and a lot of my work is going to focus on moving forward, is there needs to be serious work on just sort of what is left liberalism trying to do in a way that could actually win more than half of the country and be compelling in of itself and move on from like the 2010s to 2020s thing. And then to your question about why Democratic Party leaders haven't sort of stepped up to the plate. So part of the problem here, and this is what happened during the Republican Party's transformation during the MAGA era, you need to have new leaders, new figures who come up. Like it's very hard when you come up through an old system or old way of doing things to like move these changes, to make these changes. There's been this very vapid Joe Rogan election thing where Dem members of Congress and politicians have become over obsessed with like TikTok and content creators and getting lots of attention in a way that doesn't actually force you to answer substantive, like useful, like genuinely like important conversations. Because the way I think about it is where TikTok and content creators and attentional theory come in is once you come up with what is the next version of left liberalism going to be, you come up with what the thing is, and then you make it popular on TikTok. Then you say, okay, I'm a wonk. I don't know how this works, but here's the thing.
That's right.
And then you then translate it. But instead, you're just seeing a lot of people just sort of like so much of like the cringe, like next boy Twitter, like embarrassing politician stuff has just come with like people getting obsessed with attention. When the donors say like, hey, we're going to spend $120 million identifying the next Joe Rogan of the left, they are forcing people to focus on that version of the project and not, hey, we're going to spend $100 million finding the next generation of people across every single category who's going to come next, right? Like, I think The Argument is like a really interesting publication. They raised $4 million. I think it's going to be very successful as a business operation, right? Like it's they've got like 6 Twitter-centric people who have big Substacks. That's going to sell subs. But the problem is none of those people are leader types. There's no JD Vance who's employed at The Argument. There's no like person like you or like me who's at The Argument, a person who like builds, and it's people who are just so, the thing that these people are so incredible at is you say to them, hey, I need you to write a witty and smart 600-word piece on this thing that just happened that will make an average reader feel smart. These people are apex gods at doing this. This is why they are incredibly wealthy and deservedly so via their Substacks. But that is a different person than a person who leads. And what's really ticked me off about left center, left donor world, I've been talking about this more in the podcast, I've gotten really good responses, is where's the $4 million that says, hey, great that we've got The Argument, you need to make arguments, but where's the $4 million to create a center-left version of Orrin Cass's American Compass organization? You need to have an organization that says like, look, if you're left liberal right now, there are all these big questions that need to be answered around like the intersection of economics, society, and culture. We need a space that's very democratic and brings in new voices and different people and makes us feel very cool, makes us feel like there's a community, brings us like spirit of democracy, and really gives people a venue for thinking through these spaces in private, but also like you put out public reports, but a lot of it's private. A lot of it's just like dinners and conversations. And it's just so, it speaks to what's broken about center left liberalism and how it has just become so sort of like wait in line, wait your turn, get your sort of position in the Biden admin. If you do well, you can maybe get a good fellowship at the Center for American Progress. And then maybe if you win, you get to do your next thing. It's just totally antithetical to, and this is something I really want to make clear to center left people. When you think, I want people in sort of my crew to think more about democracy, but not democracy in the sense of like, we need third parties or we need to reform first past the post voting or the typical democracy reform thing. Just think about like, how are you bringing democratic thinking into your theory of how you operationalize yourself with politics? What I would do if I were a center left politician, and the thing that I'm waiting for someone to say is basically like, hey, I'm gonna go do this tour, but this tour isn't me just sort of reciting my latest buzzword about neoliberalism, or I'm a liberal patriot, or actually I'm not woke. It would actually, or abundance is the answer. What I would say is, hey, like, real talk, what do you guys think about things? Because I'm from Washington, and not only do you not want to hear someone say I'm from Washington and I'm here to help, but at least back in the 1980s, people got the sense that Washington at least had some answers. We don't have answers right now. So genuinely, like, and also, by the way, the Democratic Party is not a party that makes it feel like people like you have a voice. So I'm actually just here to listen. Like, let's just like talk about stuff. Country feels broken. Like, why do you feel like it's broken? But also, like, what do you think we need to actually like make this better?
Yeah.
That is what
And
I'm looking to see some politician do.
And Marshall, it's interesting. I had several months ago, we were doing a parent roundtable, and I don't know exactly where we were for this one, but somebody said something along these lines. It drives us crazy when our elected officials come here, give a speech, then leave, post on social media that they've been there, but actually have taken no time to listen. And they said, this group said to me, they said, if our politicians would just sit and listen, they would score some major points, regardless of party or regardless of where they stand on the issues. And I think this is something that Americans probably feel quite keenly across the board, that their politicians just, frankly, aren't listening, even when they show up in their communities.
I want to make something very clear, though, because I totally agree with you, but this is where like we have to translate what we're talking about away from the Washington version. There's a AirSats like superficial version of listening, which is like, I'm going to conduct a listening tour of Rust Belt America, and I'm going to go to the forgotten parts of rural America, and I'm going to memorize a couple anecdotes about how you've been left behind, and I'm listening. That's fake, and everyone can tell. They don't quite have like the language, but everyone can tell that's fake. That doesn't count. That doesn't mean anything. I think this has to, I think, and I don't quite know how to put this. I think this is maybe just where, like, at a certain point, like, you just need generationally talented politicians. People could tell, like, when you're actually listening. There's just a way that you at talent level have to make clear that like listening isn't just sort of like this back and forth thing you do every 2 years. Since 2016, the Democratic Party has not given any indication at a narrative and at a leadership level that this party cares about small d democracy. That this party isn't just a revolving door of people who flip between the public and private sector and all go to the same conferences. And by the way, I go to these conferences too, so I need to be very honest about this. But like at least like you should just be uncomfortable about going to these conferences. That's like my bare minimum. But my point is like you have to project democracy and I think if you could actually project and feel that viscerally, people will take that seriously in terms of listening.
Marshall, one of the things that I think is quite sort of typical of the center left, the philanthropic community on the center left, the donor class on the center left, to some extent the advocacy community on the center left, is that it's very invested in technocratic solutions. And our colleague Elliot Haspel has written about this actually just this week, that there's this democratic idea from the Obama years that no one should pay more than 7% of one's income on childcare. But building on some work that Patrick Brown did, Elliot makes the point that nobody actually really knows now where that number comes from, and it frankly doesn't feel particularly good to most Americans. Most Americans aren't sitting around thinking about what 7% of their income is and whether or not they should be paying 7% of their income on childcare, particularly when they might be spending 50% of their income, for example, on housing. And also, people don't know what 7% of their income is, right? Is that before taxes? Is it after taxes? Is it net? Is it gross? Whatever. And to my mind, this is like one of these solutions, very technocratic solutions, baked up from a very well-meaning place of wanting to help families afford childcare, but just doesn't resonate with the ordinary American voter, certainly the ordinary American family. And I think in a lot of ways, this is the type of thing that has not only sort of catalyzed alienation towards politicians from ordinary Americans, but also to their government, to this ecosystem of philanthropic organizations and advocates who purport to speak on behalf of families. So just like, where should we understand that, particularly in light of the Trump efforts around DOGE to just sort of rip out this technocracy from the roots in the federal government?
I think part of the problem in terms of the Democratic Party's self-presentation is that the technocracy, technocratic, meritocracy, I went to the best schools ever sort of liberalism has put technocracy to the type of thing. So like, this is the problem I have with the argument as a publication, because as a publication, it is the embodiment of a certain era of Vox era 2014. The Democratic Party explains things. We're the explainer people. Here's that 7%. Here's this number, right? It should be noted that like you saying this 7% statistic, this comes from an era where that was just everything.
Right.
And this isn't elevating people who are storytellers, people who sort of, and once again, like it should be noted, like the people who sort of work in the sort of explainer of sense of politics, and not just at the argument, but they literally live in DC and New York. So they have, it's not just that they're technocrats, it's not just that they went to good schools, it's that they're living in a very specific world versus like someone was talking to me on a podcast recorded yesterday to explain like the abundance agenda. I just don't think it clicks. It doesn't really matter. And I said, look, I would never, ever, ever, if I were like door knocking in Austin or running for office here in Texas, say like, I'm an abundance Democrat. What I would talk about is stories. And here's a story that I know that like needs technocracy to be turned into, to actually get to the destination. But like, think of like my point about the destination and like the sort of the people and then the vehicle, that metaphor from earlier. The story I tell is a buddy of mine is getting married. He went to like more than fine schools. He works a good job in Texas, in Austin. He's like really sort of on the up and up. He's getting more responsibility at work. He's getting married. And guess what? He's going through a real frustrating time right now because not only do they have to pay for their wedding, because that's super expensive, but they also are having a serious debate where they're going to live. His soon-to-be wife is in her late 20s. He's in his early 30s, and he is ready to move to the suburbs because he wants his 4-bedroom house and he wants to have a yard and he wants it also to be affordable, because the thing about Austin, even though prices went up, if you are willing to drive 40 minutes, you can get the type of house that people on the East Coast or the West Coast would just like dream of out here. But this is a problem because his soon-to-be wife, she's still in her late 20s. Her friends are still around. She wants to be closer to the city. And that means right now they're going to have to rent. They're going to have to rent because there are no affordable housing options they could actually buy. And this is like a real problem for them. So like when I think of like the abundance agenda and the sort of like vision, it's crazy to me that and this is where I think people should acknowledge how something's broken. You gain trust by people by acknowledge brokenness, and then you come to your program rather than the opposite way you tend to do these things in Democratic Party politics. But like, it is crazy to me, and not just nostalgia bait, not just this mythical 1950s, that it is not possible for my friends to buy starter homes, because it's not like they're going to have 3 or 4 kids right away. they would be fine if a 3 bedroom with a 2 bedroom with like a yard. So what abundance is about is saying like, hey, like we're going to work really hard to make sure we get more of this housing. And you can judge us as politicians, as thinkers, as a policy movement by the degree to which we actually build and make you able to live your life this way. And yes, we're going to have some technocrats actually come up with like, what are the square footage requirements and those different things, but they're not leading the project. It's not sort of like, we're going to have a bunch of wonks at my very loved think tank Niskanen and write a bunch of policy papers and hand them out to voters. That isn't how it actually works. Like what I did there is I took like an abundance theory of we need more housing and more different types of housing and like actually articulated it in a way that would resonate with a lot of people who like aren't just like around me, but also just frankly aren't sort of living the DC's version of this story.
And we think that childcare is another fine example. And I will say when we host these parent roundtables across the country, there are 4 things I always say come up: housing, the cost of healthcare, the cost of childcare, and the amount of time that people do not feel that they get to spend with their kids that they would really like to spend with their kids, often because they're working too much just to make ends meet. And but when it comes to childcare, what people really want are care options. They don't just want affordability. They want options so that grandma can take care of the kids if that's what works best for our family, and it's not just one sort of cookie cutter solution that only costs 7% of your income.
Yep. No, totally. And I think that's another important thing too. Like I just had a kid, my son Theo is 8 months old, and like childcare is actually crazy. Like it's kind of funny. Like
Right.
we moved to Austin from New York City, and I told myself in terms of we all have stories that we tell ourselves. I was like, the best thing about moving from New York to Austin to the nice American suburbs is like there's gonna be so many childcare options. None of these like $50,000 competitive pre-Ivy League preschools for me. Austin suburbs don't have those, but it's still incredibly expensive. It's crazy how expensive it is and how you just still can't accept, you still can't escape that. And there are wait lists like crazy. Like these are actual people's experiences. And I think it's just so important that you start with there and
Right.
start by saying that's screwed up rather than just sort of saying like our job is to defend people. No one thinks they're actually doing this, but too often like people, especially in the center, just find themselves defending the status quo. They're more motivated by like rejecting like analytical and philosophical mistakes and frankly evil things that populists say. These are real things rather than sort of saying, but like this is the politician in me. I just glom onto the parts that the populists are just correct about. And I say, like, okay, then what can we do with this? And actually, a lot of these voters would be more willing to listen to us if we started there rather than by saying, well, here's why we're going to explain to you why everything is better than it could be in the past, or why actually the story of that 50s is untrue. I'm not interested in disproving that to anyone. That's not how this actually works when you talk to people.
So as we look ahead, we're living through a political realignment. It frankly feels turbulent, I think, to a lot of people. How do you think we should be thinking about the well-being, the flourishing of families and communities over the next, say, 10 to 15 years? And what do you think we could actually meaningfully do to improve lives for more families, more communities, despite the political turbulence that we're living through?
Yeah, and quick 30-second, because I know we're hitting time here. I want to answer the philanthropic question you asked, because it's actually like desperately important. Here's what philanthropy at the center level like needs to do. So like less technocracy funding, less studies, less obsessions with metrics and quote theories of change. The right is much more willing to invest at the talent level in people. Like I got the Realignment's funding because a donor met me and was sort of like, okay, Marshall, you seem smart. This realignment idea is interesting. Like, here's 50K, and I'll maybe check in on you if you are successful. That was just it. Versus, like, I had people on the side a lot who love the realignment say, like, oh, we never would have taken your 2019 version pitch because, like, you couldn't prove metrics. You'd never worked in media before. So that is just the problem. So, like, that's where the technocracy thing you're putting out, like, really, really matters. You feel so smart and so meritocratic focusing on these indices. But what the center and the center left needs to do more of is just sort of, like, be more focused on talent and the individual's like ability to actually do things. So that's just like my advice there. Oh, and then lastly, spend more time elevating actual leadership types. technocratic philanthropists. You guys have funded so many great projects and so much great work. Like all of the books are on the shelf. I
Right.
think the solutions are in one of the books that I may not have all read yet behind me somewhere. What we actually lack, though, are people with credibility who could do something with it. Fund those people. Don't just fund more people who write books, because people who lead and build things are different than people who write books and read policy papers. But to your actual question, where the family could go, so like I love like your summary of healthcare, childcare, housing, like flexibility, like those things. Like I what we can really do is a use those as like starting points for like if you look at American life through the lenses you just described, because I talk to a lot of politicians in private, so I explain this to them. I'm like, hey, on all of those metrics, if your average voter, even a center left voter, hears that story, they're going to think the country's broken. And there are times in this country's past where unironically things were better, and the leadership class of the country was better oriented around like delivering articulations or like solutions to this. And then guess what? Like we used to have a solution to this, because this is what's funny about like this is why the neoliberalism thing like really matters and isn't just like wonky and academic. Neoliberalism actually had a theory of the case in the 1990s. Like like, this is when we're growing up.
Yeah.
You you graduate from high school, you go to college, you get a good degree that will get you a job in the new economy. That was the phrase. Lots of books with
Right.
the new economy. And if you do that, you're going to be able to be successful. And like that is just like literally. And here's the thing, like it's not insane. It's not an insane. I think sometimes the new right is too dunky on that. If we're sitting around in 1995, like I was born in 92, so I'm just young enough to remember when my parents got Windows 95 in our house. We got a gateway computer. It was incredible. And then I remember we connected on the internet. Like I remember this, like it's one of my first memories. I totally get why you would come up with a theory for addressing housing and job security and the new American dream in that context. That context is gone, and politicians no longer could coast on the answers from that period. So we need politicians who understand politics and policy through the lens of the things you just listed in terms of your focus areas, and then put the work in a way that isn't going to be sexy, isn't going to immediately reward them in a way that doing like JD Vance clapback TikToks will. But will actually kind of like be a thing. And this is where philanthropy matters. Philanthropy, by just being able to pay the bills, I don't mean just like donating to politicians in a corrupt way. A philanthropy could literally just say, and I want them to do this, they could literally just say, hey, we're going to convene a big conference and get all of the big people to come, where we're just going to say, how does liberalism respond to the realignment? And because people are so driven by, and there'd be a big New York Times report and there'd be a Wall Street Journal piece. You get Ezra and Ross Douthat to record a podcast. It'd be so cool, it'd be so hot. You'd feel smart. Let's get an Aspen sponsorship there. If philanthropy did that, I don't think they understand the degree to which they can just like set the table. I mean, like you probably saw there was a big national conservatism conference in DC that went on the same time during the during the abundance conference. Why is there not a future of liberalism conference? It's genuinely like this is where I'm like Mugatu and Zoolander. Like I feel like I'm taking crazy pills where I'm just like, I don't understand why this is not a thing. So this is what, because you're a lot, but that's what I don't understand. And I am
Yeah, and with
genuinely.
our particular issues, right, we would have a track at that conference that's focused on families and communities, or maybe two tracks focused on those things, and really come up with generating some solutions, some new ideas. To your point earlier, this is really about American liberalism, not one party or another.
Who cares? That's boring. Yeah, like that's
Right.
and here's the thing too. And I just want to put a pin on this, where it's like the version of me coming to you saying, "Hey, I'm from the Democratic Party. Can you do a track on the family?" That's just like not. That just isn't it. Versus, hey, like American liberalism is a thing. It's a project. It has made some major achievements, especially during like the New Deal and like the Great Society era, and it needs to focus on the problems that you, Joe, are focused on. That is something that would compel you, even if your politics do not perfectly line up with like, I'm going to vote for whoever Democrats nominate in 2028.
Right.
This is just a critical missing
Right.
thing.
So, Marshall, last question. What is one project that you've dreamed about but haven't started yet?
I would love to kind of build this conference we were just discussing, but combine it with a center left version of American Compass. So not just that we're doing a fancy conference of all the sponsorships, because like the sponsorships and the conference and the vibes and the podcasters there, they matter in terms of giving like brand credibility and like making it cool for people to show up at sort of price of admission. But I also wouldn't want this conference just to be like, hey, so here is Joe doing a panel. No, like what I would actually love is so like I did a great podcast of states forums. So they would focus on like, Democrats and liberals and state legislators. I would love to have a bunch of state legislators who have never, like no one's ever heard of, do like a private conversation with you about these topics at this event. So track one would be like a very public panel, but I also love like a side thing. And then I'd also love that to like lead into like a speaker series and like different dinners. I did an abundance dinner with Oregon state legislatures with like 20 different people. It was super cool. And it was just so different than the typical way we approach these. So this is my big dream. Someone give me the money. Or if you just want to do this yourself, go for it, because I just want this to happen. This is the easiest fruit. This is like the lowest level fruit that you could pick ever.
Yeah. Well, Marshall, thank you so much, and congratulations. I actually didn't know you were a relatively new father, so congratulations, and thanks so much for all you do and for helping us to understand the realignment that we're living through.
Yeah, and congrats and best of luck on the new podcast.
Thanks.